Okay, just want to start off by taking the opportunity to welcome you all here. My name is Robert Hughes with the Open University of the Left. We are now beginning, what, our 25th year? What is it, 1988? 1988, yeah, been around a while. Just a couple of matters of business, and I'm going to hand this off to Eric Schuster, who's going to introduce Kim for you. Just a couple of things. We have some upcoming events, which I'm going to, actually, one is in the can, I should say. The rest is like somewhat hanging fire. After today, our next scheduled event is on March 16th, when we're going to welcome, and he's sitting here in our audience right now, Loren Langman, professor at Loyola University, Department of Sociology. His presentation will be entitled Identity, Hegemony, and the Reproduction of Domination. This is a title for a book he's currently working on. Throughout history, the greatest barriers to progressive agendas were the workers' own values, understandings, and even identities that constrained them from acting in their own interest. Antonio Gramsci's theory of hegemony, while not offering a general theory of society, history, or social change, as a dialectical theory, it offers the potential for a unique perspective for linking the critical psychology with the critique of class domination. So those last three sentences, I should tell you, Loren gave me 27 written pages, and that's a condensation of that, but in any event, I think it does highlight that. But in any event, moving right along, we have, this is something we're working on right now, and I'm not going to mention any names because it hasn't happened yet, but we're hoping to perhaps get a economist here from Northwestern University who is actually going to deliver a presentation, perhaps in April. Not quite certain about this. He will be addressing, if this actually happens, the problems that we have he's basically a bourgeois economist, and he wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal, which is entitled, and you can Google this if you want, it's very interesting, it's entitled, Why Innovations Won't Save Us. And he lays out an argument that the US economy grew for more than a century thanks to big inventions. And he sees basically going forward, this is like, it's past. You know, this is not happening, at least there's nothing in the offing like that. And consequently, his opinion is that the future is pretty dismal. Well, it's kind of interesting when we can come to some kind of agreement with, like, you know, essentially a capitalist economist. And but I think that this would be a very, very interesting topic, and if we're able to get him, if, you know, it's a possible, we're working on this, by all means, we're going to do it. So, what else? I think that's about all I have. I don't know, is there anybody here that's new to this, has never ever been to an OUL event before? Oh, okay, couple. We're going to pass around a sign-in sheet, so we'd like to get like your email address, so going forward we can just give you announcements about upcoming stuff. So I won't trouble you with anything else beyond that. And Eric, you want to take this now?
Thanks, Robert. Good afternoon, my name is Eric Schuster, and welcome to the Open University of the Left at Chicago's Lincoln Park Public Library. The Open University of the Left, Chicago's oldest continuous progressive and leftist film and forum series. You can find our events and our webcasts at openuniversityofleft.org and on Facebook and on YouTube. Asking how's the weather used to be a safe conversation starter. Today that same question has cataclysmic implications. In Australia, temperatures have reached 129 degrees Fahrenheit. US government agencies now say that the seawater level at the height of the Hurricane Sandy storm surge will be equivalent to that of an average day in just a few decades. And here in Chicago, people under the age of 25 have only known winters significantly warmer than the historical average. It is no longer adequate to add a sentence or two on ecology to our critiques of industrial capitalism. For those who have theorized around eco-socialism and eco-socialist analysis, like the physicist Vandana Shiva, the political economist John Bellamy Foster, and the activist Bill McKibben, all suggest the urgency of a profound transformation of consciousness and engagement. Here to guide us through the relationships between capitalism, empire, and ecological crisis is Dr. Kim Scipes. Kim is Associate Professor of Sociology at Purdue University. He's a longtime labor and social change activist and a widely published author in academic and popular media. His latest book is The AFL's Secret War on Developing Country Workers, Solidarity or Sabotage, just out from Lexington Books. And his current project is a book tentatively titled Building International Labor Solidarity, Lessons from the Philippines, South Africa, Europe, and the United States. Please welcome Kim Scipes.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming, and I'm delighted to see so many people here. So I'm very pleased about this. This talk came out of some of the thinking I've been doing about the labor movement. But I argue these issues are too important. Come on in, folks. There's some seats up front if you want to park yourself. This is too important to confine it just to the labor movement. These are issues I think that everyone on the left, however you define that position, needs to address. So if people want to talk about the labor movement, we can do it during the Q&A session, but I'm going to keep it broader than that. And I think ultimately, the issue that we're talking about at hand is why is the left, however you want to define it, why are we so marginalized in a time when we're so desperately needed? At times when Americans are hurting so much, why aren't they seeking leftist analysis, leftist inspiration, leftist organization, whether initiated by themselves or by a leftist organization? So while we can argue forever about whether Americans are too stupid to realize this or not, I'm going to argue it's not because Americans are too stupid, but because the left is too incoherent. In other words, I'm arguing that the problems of the left are due first and foremost to ourselves. And while I'd argue that a lot of this is organizational or political competition, itself silly when trying to build collectivity, it goes far beyond this. So what I'm going to try to do today, I'm going to argue that most leftist analysis, and again, I'm using that term in the broadest sense, place yourself wherever you want to, wherever you're historically located, or if you're trying new things, or just even wondering about it. I'm going to argue that what the left has tried to explain what's going on with is by looking at either our economic system, our foreign policy, or the ecological catastrophe that's impending upon us. Now, the more sophisticated analysis, I'd argue, are putting two of those three things together. But I would argue that that is still insufficient. I think we've got to combine, we've got to put together three legs of what I'm calling a three-legged stool. I think we've got to talk about the U.S. empire, I think we've got to talk about U.S. capitalism, and we've got to talk about global change, climate change. So that's what I'm talking about today, and I'm going to try to put them together in a way that makes sense coherently for us. The argument is that each of these individual areas has sufficient weaknesses that can only be overcome by combining the three together. Now, I will also point out there's other things going on in the world. These are not the only problems that we face, but these three areas seem to be the most that get consistently discussed and argued about in the alternative press. So I'm going to talk about this, and theoretically I've been very influenced by a man who's Dutch by heritage. He now teaches at the University of California at Santa Barbara, a man named Jan Nederman Petersen, who wrote a brilliant book that I highly recommend called Empire and Emancipation, Power and Liberation on a World Scale. This book came out in 1989 and is simply the single best understanding of imperialism that I've ever read, and I've read a lot of them. Okay, so this is a different approach than, say, some of you may be familiar with world systems theory. Jan, in his book, sort of theoretically disembowels that, I argue. But he builds off the Marxist understanding of Lenin, but transcends it, saying that Lenin is not sufficient, that we've got to understand imperialism as not just an economic process, but that an economic and political process, and we have to look situation by situation to see which is primary. So in other words, he's arguing some situations that that economics is primary, but in other situations, politics, which can include anything from the will to dominate to geostrategic positioning. Sometimes that's primary. So we've got to look at them. So there's not one size fits all. It will vary. Now, one of the interesting things that's been happening over the last year, you don't necessarily see it a whole lot in the popular press, but you see it definitely in the academic world, is the growing recognition that the United States has an empire. Now, for those of us with gray hair and were around in the 60s, that term was a term used back in the 60s, and then it went away. And it really didn't come back, as far as I can see. I wasn't looking for this. Bill Bloom, who does a periodic email account on the Empire, once asked me who was the earliest one to come up with this term or started revitalizing the term, and it was a piece I wrote in 1984 when I described the U.S. as an empire and argued that there were two empires in the post-World War II period, the U.S. empire as well as the Soviet empire. But there's a growing understanding that the U.S. has an empire. Key to that understanding challenges what we've been told all our lives in school, and that is the United States is exceptional. And the way that's been put forth is that we're separate from the rest of the world. And I think that's a lie. In fact, I know it's a lie. I argue that from the very beginning of Europeans coming over here, what happened in North America has always been part of a global process, or global processes, and that it's been a period where we affect the rest of the world and the world affects us. You cannot separate us from the rest of the world. That also means, particularly in the post, well, you could argue at least going back to the Spanish-American War of 1898, when we spread around the world and took over Philippines, Cuba, Guam, as well as the Philippines after an incredibly brutal war, that you cannot understand the United States only by looking at the geographic United States. You have to recognize that our social order extends around the world. We cannot confine ourselves just to the geographic United States. Now, when I use the term empire, I'm not using it in the way that we think of the Roman Empire, of territorial acquisition. Yes, there are obviously some cases where that happened, but primarily I'm talking about where the U.S. has worked to dominate other countries through economic and political processes. Okay, so I'm arguing that the U.S. has a global empire, and then I'm not going to get into it today, but in my book on the AFL-CIO foreign policy, I argue that this imperialism is not confined just to the nation state. Again, following Nederman Petersen, I argue that they can be supranational, in other words, like the UN sending troops to control Haiti, peacekeepers, or it can be subnational, such as the AFL-CIO engaging in labor imperialism against other labor movements. So I'm using a much broader sense. But one of the things that we see happening is that the spread of U.S. power that is trying to dominate the world, most particularly in the post-World War II period, And I'm going to argue that U.S. foreign policy, the U.S. government, I should say, under both the Democrats and the Republicans, is that it has a larger purpose than just to engage with the rest of the world. But I'm going to argue its purpose is to maintain and extend U.S. hegemony over other political communities of the world for the benefit of the United States government itself, the ruling elite, as well as corporate capital in general, which is predominantly U.S. owned, but that's becoming to a smaller and smaller extent. And as Nick Terse has shown in his brilliant new book on Vietnam, if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's called Kill Everything That Moves, the real U.S. war in Vietnam. What he shows is that the U.S. government will unleash all but unlimited violence to get its way. Okay, so one of the things is we're starting to understand this stuff, and it's not just Chomsky saying that. For example, we have people, Tom Everhart, Bill Bloom, Francis Fox Piven, Alfred W. McCoy, people like this, myself, etc., who've taken this this larger understanding, and we're expanding it, and we're understanding it around the world. And we cannot, I would argue very strongly, we cannot limit our understanding of what's going on to just the geographical United States. Okay, but one of the problems with looking at empire is they rarely make the connection between U.S. capitalism and global climate change either way. In other words, we've opened up this new understanding of empire. It's there. It's very, very robust. It's very powerful, but it also is limited. Now, on the other side, as those of us who've read outside the mainstream, it's long been recognized that Marxism has provided the greatest critique of the capitalist economic system. As we know, Marxism has been dismissed by most of our great thinkers, but those of us who think for ourselves dismiss them and go on and read a little Marx here and there. The most extensive effort in the United States to develop the understanding, the Marxist understanding in the country, I would argue, are the people associated with and write for the Journal Monthly Review. Certainly Paul Sweezy, the great Nobel Prize winner, economics winner, and his author Paul Baran advanced this in their 1966 classic Monopoly Capitalism, and others have moved to expand this as well. But what they've shown is the contradiction right at the heart of the system between creation of use value and exchange value. In other words, between making things for use versus things for sale. The effect on workers, such as the alienation of their labor, the exploitation of their labor power, and things such as this. This is extremely a powerful and robust analysis. However, most Marxists have not gone and theoretically analyzed the monopoly stages, which Baran and Sweezy did in Monopoly Capitalism. And one of the things that it's showing is that, you know, prices, for example, keep going up. Profits keep going up because there's no counter. In other words, when he got to the stage of monopoly, where only a few corporations dominate each sector of the economy, they basically came to, if you will, a gentleman's agreement not to reduce prices. They want to keep prices going up. Like, other than, say, a recession, have we ever seen car prices go down? Just has never happened. They keep going up. And what this has done is this has created more and more money for capitalist industry, and the problem they have is absorbing it. In other words, it's profitable reinvestment. Because what happens is they make more money, they invest it, and because it's a rigged game, they can only make more money. So they're always searching places to put the money because they're trying to tie it up, and they can't find those places. And one of the things that we see, John Bellamy Foster of Monthly Review came up with, and Fred Magdoff came up in their 2009 book on the global housing crisis, or the global financial crisis, was that they said the possibility that this enormous surplus capital that fed this financial explosion can be absorbed under productive investment in the present system is just absurd. It can't do it. Okay, so it's this problem that we've got this ever expanding. They're making more and more money, producing more and more crap, expanding it around the world. It keeps going. And it's ultimately, it's failing our country. I mean, what we see right now, if you look at U.S. government figures, the government tracks things such as poverty. They track things such as economic inequality. You can all find it in their publications, their materials, even on the web. But right now, the government has had a very insufficient level of poverty. So every year they figure out what a family or what the people can live on, at what level it becomes. They say they're in poverty. So right now, this year, they say that a family of 4, if they make less than $23,015 a year, for a family of 4, regardless whether it's one breadwinner or 2, that family is in poverty. At that level today, we have a poverty rate of 15%, and we have over 46 million Americans in poverty. We have more people in poverty by the numbers than we have in any time since 1959 when poverty started getting measured. Okay. However, one of the things that's consistent in the literature is that's a terribly insufficient level. I would hate to have to live with 4 people on $23,015 a year. It can't be done, needless to say. A more realistic figure that the research among poverty researchers have come to is that it's about twice of that, about 200% of the poverty level. So roughly about $44,000 a year is required to sufficiently keep people out of poverty. That would be for a family of 4. Now, if you apply that 44,000, then what you realize is 34.1%, over 1/3 of all Americans are in poverty. Think about that. That's a pretty profound statement. Over 1/3 of all Americans, using a realistic poverty figure, are in poverty. Not only that, we've lost, it would take something like 9 million jobs just to get us back to where we were before the Great Recession. There's no way on God's green earth those jobs are going to be created in the first place, and 2, they're damn sure not going to pay well and with good benefits and things like that. There is no way out, and I've been studying this since 1984, so 29 years, periodically looking at this, and we are not going to be able to create jobs to get us back to where we once were, period. That's not a debatable issue in my point of view. What has happened, basically, it's because the reason we did so well in the period from 1947 to 1973, and we did very well, real incomes after inflation was taken out doubled. So if somebody was making $10,000 in 1947, by 1973 they were making $20,000. That growth was real, and one other thing, that growth was fairly equitably distributed. Okay. We have not had that since. In fact, I'm waiting for a couple more years for the data. But when I did my last piece in 2009, where I looked at the latest figures on income in this country, during the first 4 years of the Bush administration, the bottom 80% of Americans lost money between 2001 and 2005. This is a trend I've been tracking for 28 years. This is not an aberration. The economic inequality is getting worse. People are having lower incomes. And there's nothing that I see, whether it's technological innovation or Obama standing on his head or anything else, Bill Riley getting religion, I don't know what you need. It ain't going to happen, folks. And I think it's just totally off the track. However, one of the problems that much of the Marxist analysis in particular does is they confine their thinking only to the United States. Or if they extend it internationally, they do so on an economistic level. They think that everything we're doing around the world is motivated by profit. And I argue that's not accurate. It can't explain things such as the Vietnam War. It can't explain, in my opinion, the invasion of Iraq. It can't explain the invasion of Afghanistan, etc., etc. Profit is, while it's an important point to keep in there, it's not sufficient in my argument. Now, talking about climate change by itself, Bill McKibben in particular, who Eric mentioned, I think, is somebody who's been writing some incredibly important stuff. He's been doing some some organizing that's brought the issue of climate change to more visibility than ever before. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you look at his article in the August issue of Rolling Stone. It's a stunning analysis. And basically what he's arguing is that there's only so much carbon and related chemicals that we can put into the air before we have serious serious deterioration of the atmosphere. And he says that 5 times of what is possibly accepted is already been found by the oil companies. If they bring that to market, just what they have already, it's game over, long over. And McKibben has been doing an incredible job in doing this. But McKibben doesn't ask why this is happening. How do we get here? He just says sort of, it's here. Okay, so I'm arguing that these single approaches, whether it be on empire, whether it be on U.S. capitalism, or whether it be on climate change, these single approaches are not sufficient. But I go further. There are some people, and myself included, who've tried to look at least 2 of those issues. So, for example, I did an article in 2009 that I tried to get published in the U.S. and nobody published it, so I ended up having to get it published in India, although it's on ZNet's website, and I can give you the URL if you're interested, where I look at the economic development of the United States in the post-World War II period from a global perspective. And I put together the concept of empire with the concept of capitalism, and I think it's a very powerful argument. What I've not done prior to right now is that I've not included the global climate change in there. So I'm criticizing my own work. I also look, the other person that in particular has done a really nice job of combining 2 things has been the aforementioned John Bellamy Foster of Monthly Review. He's a professor of sociology at University of Oregon, but he's also the editor of Monthly Review. And he's trying to put together, and has done a lot of writing, combining a Marxist analysis of capitalism with global climate change. He and Brett Clark, who he's worked with, came out with a very important article, and Peter reminded me as well, called The Planetary Emergency, in the December issue of Monthly Review. It's got some good stuff, and he's followed it up with a critique of James Hansen's work in the February 2013 issue of Monthly Review. So I think Bellamy Foster is doing some excellent work. However, he doesn't talk about empire. Now I know for those of you who've read Monthly Review or you're familiar with their work, they oftentimes carry a lot of work in the journal itself about things happening around the world, and that's not the concept of empire is not one that is foreign to their approach, but they never develop it. And this is interesting. I went back and reread Monopoly Capital because I was unsure. And what I found is there's even a specific footnote where they use the term U.S. capital and identify the countries at the time. This was written back, probably finished about '64. The countries it said belonged to the U.S. empire. But they've never incorporated that into the larger understanding. And I think that's one of the limitations of the Monthly Review approach, is that they don't address the issue of empire on anywhere. I would argue in general they don't do it at all, but certainly they don't do it in a sufficient manner. Okay, all right, if you can follow that so far, I think I'm making a fairly strong argument that neither a single factor analysis or even a double factor analysis has not been able to address this. And I'm going to argue that we need a fuller analysis. And I want to draw some of this out because I think I can put it together. All right, we have to understand that the U.S. economy has been and remains the most productive economic system the world has ever seen. This is an economic system based on a slave-based plantation agricultural system that was so profitable. It provided the capital for industrialization, both in scope and depth, and it projected the U.S. economy to the fore globally prior to World War I. Okay? further, the U.S. economy emerged even stronger out of World War II. I don't know if you know this, but in 1947, that 48% of all the goods and services in the world were produced by our 6% of the population. In other words, if we had hit 50%, we would have produced as many goods and services as all the other countries in the world combined. So we come out of World War II, we're the only industrialized country that's not devastated by the war, and damn, we built new factories to produce for the war. We gave a lot of them to the corporations for little or nothing. But our economic system was in just incredible shape. Now, however, events in the 1930s and early 40s provided the social stability required for the further development of the economic system. And key to this was industrial unionism, and this was predominantly featured by put forth by the unions in the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. All right. After World War II, in the first year after the war, so September 45 to September 46, sees the largest strike wave in the history of the country. Over 116 million production days were lost. There were national strikes in auto, steel, meatpacking, electrical parts. The Teamsters were on strike, the woodcutters in the Northwest. There were general strikes in Oakland, Stamford, Connecticut, places like this. Now, those were important, but I think their political impact was even bigger than what they gained for their members. And it was a political message, I'd argue. And it was telling the captains of industry, if you will, says, look, folks, the world's devastated. They need our production. You guys, after you knock off your water bottles, you guys can make incredible profits out here. But if you want production, you've got to cut us in on the deal. And they had the muscle to do it. 80% of industry was organized by unions at the end of World War II. And that was basically the deal, so that when we had this tremendous growth in production from 47 to 73, that happened because of the sales and the productivity around the world, etc. It was shared fairly equally. Not because capitalism was benign, but because the labor movement had the strength and said, damn it, you either cut us in or you ain't getting shit. Put it in precise academic terminology. Now, however, there were some factors that undermined the power of the American labor movement. And first of it was the determination by the elites in the U.S. to dominate the non-Soviet part of the world after the war. And for the propagation for an acceptance of this by conservative and moderate labor leaders. Tied into this was the purge of broader thinking unionists from the labor movement. In 1949, the CIO expelled 11 different unions containing somewhere around 750,000 to 1 million workers. And the FBI at that time said supposedly this was due to the communist influence. Well, the FBI later admitted only 16,000 of the 750,000 were actual members of the Communist Party. They used the term communism to get to those that were thinking outside the box. So this would include the old wobblies that were still around, different anarchists, radical muskyites, just rank and file militants, anybody that wanted a labor movement more powerful than just negotiating good deals with management. This got purged, and I would argue the labor movement has never recovered from these purges in 1949. And basically what the more conservative and moderate labor movement accepted was that basically union membership could be bought off with successes from better collective bargaining agreements, regardless of the detrimental social impact. And this is the period where union members did quite well. You think of members in the steel workers or the auto workers or any of the big industrial unions that did quite well, had good health care and things like this. But the problem was, without challenging the system, is that these corporations could shut down. They could refuse to bargain. They could move, whether in the U.S. or overseas, and labor couldn't do anything about it. Okay, and over time this cuts down. But the question is, if they're going overseas, where are they going and how are they getting there? This is why the concept of empires got to be addressed. Because where they went, particularly in the developing world, were countries that were dominated by the U.S. or its allies. Okay? These were countries where the U.S. government had helped overthrow democratically elected governments, such as Iran in 53, Guatemala 54, Brazil 64, Chile 73. It was also going to the dictatorships we were supporting, such as Marcos in the Philippines, Suharto in Indonesia, Mobutu Sese Seko in the Congo, for South Africa, which had a white dictatorship, etc., etc. We can't understand where these jobs could go without understanding that the U.S. basically made the world safe for capitalist investment, and the capitalists took that and have run with it and have transferred, almost all of the labor-intensive jobs in this country. First to countries like Mexico, then to China, etc. Those jobs aren't coming back, and there's no way we can compete at those wage levels with what they've been able to do there. Now, workers in some of those countries have made incredible efforts to build new labor movements. I point out most specifically the labor movements in Brazil, South Korea, the Philippines, and South Africa. But despite this, still capital's been able to go to areas where labor has not been able to build with the support of repressive governments. They've been able to make the world safe for capitalist investment. Primarily American, but not only American. Okay? So we've got to do that. And what has been happening now also is that the U.S. has been exporting our polluting industries overseas as well. So we're shifting jobs from here overseas because they pollute more and they have weaker environmental regulations and restrictions. So this is going on in this whole world post-World War II. Of course, there are liberation movements that are trying to struggle against this. Vietnam and Cambodia, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, etc. But the U.S. basically, once the Soviet Union collapses in 1991, the U.S. has hegemony over the world. We were the top dog, nobody could challenge us, and that extended till about 2003, maybe 2005. Somebody, for some reason, forgot to tell the Iraqi resistance movement that we were the big dog. And for some reason, they just didn't roll over and play dead. They didn't tell the Afghanis either, it seems. But anyway, that's another point. The point that we're trying to make here is that U.S. imperialism cannot be collapsed just to overseas economic opportunities for U.S. corporations, no matter how profitable. There is also the ability to dominate much of the world for its own purposes, whatever they may be, but is defined by U.S. elites, not caring about us or whatever. So you have the expansion. Oh, and by the way, before I make the next step, one of the things that's also happened is we have more global economic competition as countries recovered from World War II. Of course, the already industrialized countries, Britain, Germany, Japan, etc. They were able to compete with us, and then you start having corporations from other developing countries like some of the Korean corporations. You have Brazilian corporations. China too, but that's a little later. But anyway, they start competing more and more, and so the U.S. is having to respond. And one of their responses, like I said earlier, was the export of labor-intensive jobs overseas. The other thing, though, and this is a part that never gets talked about in public discourse generally, is what about those companies or those industries that couldn't move? And if you look at a capital-intensive industry like steel, you get an idea. What has happened with the steel industry is technological displacement. As they build new machines, these machines need fewer and fewer and fewer workers. To give you a very vivid idea of this, very close to home here, if you look at steel employment from South Chicago to Burns Harbor, Indiana, so right around the tip of the lake, maybe 10 miles deep, as late as 1984, there were over 120,000 unionized production steelworkers. And they were all in one organization, District 31 of the United Steelworkers. Today, the United Steelworkers has had to restructure their organization. They've now renamed it District 7. But District 7 covers the entire states of Indiana and Illinois. And my back of the envelope calculation is they have somewhere today around 17 to 19,000 members. And they're not all steel workers. That includes nurses, that includes county workers, and it includes school bus drivers. So at very least in this very limited, small region, we have lost over 100,000 production steelworker jobs, unionized steelworker jobs in the last 25 years. Those jobs ain't ever coming back. Okay, so we're not only losing the suffering from the outsourcing that is fairly commonly known today, but we're also suffering from the technological displacement. But like I say, where they moved the production that left, of course, they went to these developing countries, and one of the things that this has caused is great ecological harm. Okay. Now, environmental devastation should not be collapsed into simply climate change. There are other problems as well, but climate change is one, particularly with this snowstorm going on in New England right now, and Hurricane Sandy, etc., that perhaps gives us the easiest way to understand it. And the simple thing about this is to understand that our planet is surrounded by a membrane, if you will, that protects us from the sun's rays and regulates the temperature of the planet. This membrane we refer to as the atmosphere. And it's just simply a bunch of chemicals that float around the Earth that are kept in place by gravity. Okay. Now, scientists can measure that carbon content in the atmosphere as far back as 650,000 years. Okay. They've really been able to refine this. Now, what they've discovered is that when the carbon in the atmosphere, when the atmospheric CO2 content varies, the temperature of the Earth responds. And what they've been able to discover over this approximately 650,000 year period is that there have been repeated cycles of cooling and warming over this period of time. Interestingly, however, at no time previous to now has the carbon dioxide component of the atmosphere exceeded 300 parts per million. Okay? Until now. The heating cycle that begins about the time of the Industrial Revolution, so we're talking 1750, that has only continued to increase, and it's followed an increasing carbon dioxide amount today that has reached 391 parts per million in 2011. So we've never gone above 300 in 650,000 years. Today we're over 391. Okay. Scientists have now say that the Earth has warmed about 0.8 degrees Celsius above what it was in 1750, with perhaps another 0.7 degrees Celsius already in the pipeline, but as of yet unmeasured. Now that doesn't sound like much, maybe 1.5 degrees Celsius over the past 263 years, so from 1750 to 2013. But the problem is that an increase of no more than 2 degrees Celsius over that period is expected to cause massive changes in our global climate system, such that it threatens the very existence of human beings, animals, and most plants on this planet by the beginning of the next century. The accompanying CO2 number, now what we're talking about is carbon dioxide itself or equivalent. They can measure equivalents, but they say the accompanying CO2 number is 450 parts per million, and we're over 391 today, or actually as of 2 years ago. Okay, now what it seems certain is that if the Earth's temperature rises 2 degrees Celsius above the temperatures in 1750, that's about 3.4 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, if I remember correctly. Anyway, if it hits that 2 degrees warming, the tundra across Canada and Russia will melt, and there are trillions of tons of methane that will be released in the atmosphere. Since methane is 23 times more harmful to the atmosphere than carbon dioxide, that means it's game over. It's that serious, folks. Okay. Now, how certain is that? That's a good question. Thank you for asking. While the caveat is that nothing in the future is certain, it is the best, most solid prediction that can be made with the level of evidence that currently exists. We know, for example, we know for certain that the average temperature of the Earth is warming. So the 10 warmest years since temperatures began being measured in 1850 have taken place in since 1998. Both 2012 and 2005 were the 2 hottest years on record. Like I say, we know the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere is at 391 parts per million. Scientists have known that global warming has been taking place for 20 years, and the evidence keeps getting stronger and stronger and more specific and reliable. We know the weather patterns that have been existed for over 100 years in this country have been changing, as we've seen in 2012. The average annual U.S. temperature jumped over a degree Fahrenheit, which scientists say this is off the charts, just between 2011 and 2012. Hurricanes have been getting stronger, as we saw in New York in 2011 and 2012.
Right.
Hurricane Irene and then Hurricane Sandy were each considered a once-in-a-100-year storm, and they happened 2 years back to back. Okay? They caused the Atlantic Ocean to surge 11 feet high and then 14 feet high, respectively. Now, whether we want to believe that this accumulating evidence in whole or only in part, it's quite clear that something unusual is affecting the global climate. As they say, it's the canary in the coal mine. So what does this all mean? George Monbiot wrote a quite excellent book in 2007 called Heat. And he says that if we're going to have a chance to keep below that 2-degree temperature rise, we have until about 2030, folks, that's 17 years, to reduce greenhouse gases in the developed countries by 90%. He believes, he looks at the different parts of society, and he believes that this can be done. But he's unable to envision accompanying changes in air travel, and he refuses to address the issue of empire and wars. So whether it's possible or not to meet this goal, nonetheless, the longer we wait to try to meet it, the less likely we'll be able to respond in time. So I'm suggesting, in fact I'm suggesting, hell, I'm arguing, that there's no question there's an interactive effect between the U.S. empire, U.S. capitalism, and global climate change. Like I say, U.S. capitalism is the most economically productive economic system the world's ever seen, but it also must be recognized as production takes place globally. It is no longer confined to the geographic U.S., nor are the greenhouse gases produced by subsidiaries of U.S. corporations confined to the geographic U.S. Joined with this is the continued expansion of capitalism across the other developed countries, each with their own related contribution to greenhouse gas emissions and their respective expansion around the globe. And then when you realize that we have the increasing development of capitalism in countries such as Brazil, India, South Africa, China, along with Russia, the so-called BRIC countries, as well as countries like Israel and Turkey, we see that capitalism is and continues to expand globally as capitalist firms seek increasing number of investment opportunities for their continued survival. Okay. Now this global expansion of capitalism is based on two things that must, in my opinion, be included in the analysis. First, the continued ability of the U.S. empire to maintain the global social order in a way that enhances the ability of capitalist firms to expand globally without generating extreme nation-state competition that could lead to war. And there's no other country that can play that role, not China certainly. The United States is the only one with the military power to do that. but it's based on fossil fuels, the production of which lead to wars. Shall we talk about Iraq in particular? But it's a production which increases greenhouse gas emissions, intensified carbon concentrations in the atmosphere, and global climate change that, like I say, realistically, by the turn of the century, threatens to exterminate humans, animals, and most plants. So the hope here to stop the onslaught, as overwhelming as it appears to be, lies in the recognition by a growing number of people around the world that capitalism in all its forms, not just the U.S. form, offers no way forward for increasing numbers of people, and that it in fact is leading towards global extermination in the foreseeable future. So in other words, that the efforts to grow, to join in a global movement for economic and social justice. In other words, I'm suggesting that to understand globalization, we recognize it's not a monolithic form as the media puts out. It's got a top-down nature that's corporate, militaristic driven, and that's being resisted from people on the bottom up, trying to create internationally to build a globalization movement from the bottom up. That we've got to recognize it's there and join it. The good news is that it's there because they're far ahead of us in many ways. Back in 2006, I was in Durban, South Africa, and spent one entire afternoon in a workshop with literally some of the poorest people on the planet, having a very sophisticated discussion about global climate change. And that was 7 years ago, and I haven't heard that level of discussion in the U.S., even among most academics. So we've got to catch up quickly. I don't know if we can. It's an open question. Anybody says that we can solve this problem, we can stop this extermination from happening. Anybody that guarantees that, I think, is lying. We don't know. But I know a couple of things. First of all, I know we've got to get the information. And for those of us who are progressives and on the left, however we put it, I think we can no longer limit ourselves to only looking at a single factor or even a double factor analysis. We've got to combine an analysis of the U.S. empire, U.S. capitalism, and global climate change and what we need to do. And that means we've got to quit. We've got to just quit saying it's a single issue or even a double issue. The other thing we have to do is we have to be clear. The big boys and girls, whether in government or in corporations or our social leaders or what, they're not going to save us. And three, that if we're going to have a chance to stop this, to turn this around, we've got to join collectively and we've got to create power from the bottom up. And we've got to do that now. We can't wait. With that, I think I'll stop. Thank you very much.
All right, we've got like approximately 45 minutes for Q&A. And I know this is like asking the impossible, but hold your questions and or comments to like 1 minute. There's like 40-odd people in here. We're not going to get everybody a chance to get up here and have their say. So, you know, be considerate of others, okay?
Hi, Kim.
Hi, Shel.
Powerful presentation. I agree with a lot of it, but I have two particular issues that I'd like you to hear. One is, I think that the idea of the threat, while it's certainly valid, is in a sense a wrong path for us, because I do think that the capitalists are still mortal and at some point will want to save themselves. And therefore, they'll come up with some technical fix, which will probably have awful side effects, but might actually deflect the temperature rise. So tying our legitimacy to the global crisis and its impossibility of fixing without it, solidarity would be a serious error, which brings me to the other point, which is that I think the big problem the left has had and continues to have is, let's call it a failure to control the means of imagination, including imagination in industrial and technological processes, which of course it is. And let me put it this way, if we had Fox News for a few years, things could change. If we had the equivalent. And without it, I don't think much can. We have to have something powerful and more continuous to make an effect. And without it, I think global cataclysm is more likely than the left resurgence. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. These are pretty profound questions. Let me take a second, and then Joe, you can come up. The first one, that the capitalists may save us with a technological fix. One, I don't think that's possible. Two, Foster himself, John Bellamy Foster, and taking on James Hansen, I think shows the problems with that. I don't think it can be saved in that way. So that raises the question of solidarity with who? Do we seek solidarity with the capitalists and the powers that be, or do we seek solidarity with the people on the bottom around the world? I think it's a no-brainer. I think we've got to throw our lot in with the people of the world. I don't think the capitalists care about us. I think they're so arrogant they don't think they themselves are mortal. The second thing, the second point you bring up, is the failure to control the means of imagination. And this is really important. But one of the things that's going on that I don't think we realize is there's a tremendous amount of work that's been done in the broad area of what we might call alternative media. I mean, there's everything from Democracy Now! to ZNet, to Truth Out, there's tons of things out there. And I think there's much more than we realize. That being said, it's not enough, and the problem is most people don't even know it exists. And that's the bigger problem, that we don't get out there. But I'm very encouraged that, for example, WCPT, who is owned by a staunch supporter of the Democrats, is broadcasting Amy Goodman at 8 o'clock in Chicago every night. I think that's an important development. Despite any arguments I might have with Amy about what she's doing, still it's an important advance. I think there's much more out there than we tend to see. I think certainly the capitalists are not advertising it for us, but I think we ourselves don't understand what's going on out there. I think there's a lot more going on. But the larger idea is, how do we get that imagination where it does exist out to people? That's the crucial step that I see, and I don't see we're real good at that. But I think there's more and more of an infrastructure out there than we might think. Joe, come on. Thank you.
When the previous questionnaire asked and said, you know, the capitalists are mortal and therefore they'll figure out some way of saving their lives, I immediately thought of all the movies that run along that line, and usually they're really bad for the rest of us. I mean, it was in 2012 and a bunch of them, where they figure out how to save the 1%, and then the rest of us, we're sort of thrown over the ship rail, literally. I was going to say that there's a few things about your talk that I really like, and I was just going to suggest that people might want to check out reading Chris Williams' book, Ecology and Socialism. It was published by Haymarket Books 2 years ago. Chris wrote some really great stuff about the Frankenstorm that hit New York City, and about Fukushima. He went to Japan to investigate this stuff himself. I think there's been a real revival of interest in sort of radical socialism and the issues of ecology. I mean, I think, you know, ever since Katrina, that we can now actually have a conversation about saving the planet and changing the system in a way that before that you would be seen as kind of an eccentric. I think lots of people agree that there's something fundamentally wrong with the world, and that there is a problem with the system, the capitalist system internationally, that creates it. Where I think the gap is people's sense of, you know, what can I do about it? And I'd like to hear just a little bit more about, you know, for example, you know, what you do on your campus, your ideas about how to connect some of this stuff with the labor movement or progressive change today, because we have to start where we are and with the enormity of things and think about what the next step is, really. What is the next step?
Okay. Does your comment follow Joe, or should I just go ahead?
Go ahead. Just respond to each question.
Well, thanks for your kind words, Joe. I think the point that you make, the powerlessness point, what do I do? I think is really there. I want to say I think people understand something's wrong. They don't know what. You know, they know they don't have a job. They might say, well, the corporation. I mean, I think there's an increased understanding of the corporations and how they bought off Congress and stuff like that. The lack of trust, I think there's a decreasing lack of trust of the Democrats. Unfortunately, the Republicans keep putting Attila the Hun against them, so the Democrats look good. I mean, there's a change, and I think people are changing. I think there's an awareness of something's going on. I mean, just a week ago, Friday night, Oliver Stone and Peter Kuznick were here. They brought out this 10-part series on the history of the U.S., by the way, which you can get at, you can Google and get and watch. The one on Vietnam, covering the years 45 to 1980, was stunning. They showed it. But the auditorium at Roberto Clemente High School that night was filled, and not just old folks, a lot younger demographic than we got here. I think people are seeing something's wrong. I think a lot of kids are realizing the idea that they're going to come out, if they get a college degree, they're going to come out and get a job immediately that pays well. That's not out there. I mean, the idea of them doing better than the next corporation is really hitting kids. I teach in Northwest Indiana. I'm not at the main campus of Purdue. I'm at Purdue North Central, which is about 6 miles south of Michigan City, 2.5 miles out of a 2-stoplight town. We're talking a real metropolis here. So I get students, many who, most of our campus is about 87% white. There's a strong religious influence. A lot of people have never even traveled to Chicago 50 miles away. So I'm not talking about kids with any progressive understanding much at all. Yet I keep teaching stuff. I keep teaching about the empire. I teach about imperialism. I teach about global climate change. And one, I was able to get tenure despite that. I'm sure they still don't understand what I'm doing out there. But the second thing is I keep getting students. And in fact, one of the things we're doing, one of the problems that I had was I taught a class on social movements and there's no movement out there. So this year I'm teaching again, and I decided, well, I'll start a social movement. So I'm having my kids start a social movement on campus to get solar panels put on the buildings. Now that's pretty innocuous in a lot of ways, but they're going to learn things because I've been doing this stuff for now 40 years. I've picked up a few tricks that aren't in the books and stuff like that, where they're going to see that they can do things, that a small group of people, to mention Margaret Mead, can change the world. And so I think part of it is showing people, one, that they've got to work together. We can't do this individually. I mean, I think the last 30 years has shown that overwhelmingly. That if we're going to have a chance, we've got to do it collectively. And I think a lot of people, particularly those, say, under 50, maybe 55 even, have no idea what that means. So we have to try to engage them and show them how to do that, to share with what we've picked up along the way. And not to, like, we know it all, but to help get them started so they can see things. We had a fascinating discussion the other night on leadership, on how you build this stuff. It can be done. Young people know that there's problems. They don't know what it is. The analysis is confusing to them because they're hearing all these different things. And that's why I'm arguing we got to put it together in a very coherent way that works. But thanks. So those are some ideas. Yes, sir.
Thanks for the speech today. I think maybe this laissez-faire attitude and free market economy we've been in the last bunch of decades, we've kind of lost the focus. And whether you're left or right or conservative or progressive, these issues have come up and bit us. Globalization, non-unionization, healthcare costs, things like that affecting the economy. So I appreciate the speech. I'm wondering if there's a reason that this climate change issue has kind of fallen off the map ever since Obama's been elected, it seems, and why it's been kind of ignored. And that's my question. And I wanted to plug my group a little bit. It's the New York and Chicago high-speed bullet train electric that will take billions of gallons of jet fuel out of the air. So I have information up here. We're trying to promote this and get this high-speed rail stuff refocused and change the narrative to the where it would be really effective. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Yes, I talked with his brother before folks started coming in. He's got some interesting things to say, so if you're interested. please talk to him. Why it's fallen off the map? I don't think it has. I think it's taking different forms. I mean, I find it very interesting that Rolling Stone is publishing some very interesting stuff right now. They published McKibben's article, and McKibben's article is incredible. It's very clear. He's very passionate. How he can't put the link with capitalism, I don't know, but the analysis of climate change is brilliant. This gets out to a lot of kids. And you know, in this week's issue, ironically dated February 14th, Valentine's Day, there's a brilliant article on rape in the U.S. military that's incredibly powerful. This stuff is getting out, it's getting in non-traditional things. No, we don't have it on the corporate media, but the stuff is getting out, and young people are seeing it in different ways. And I think the problem is not a lack of information, but how to put it together in a coherent whole. And this is one of the things that going to college helps you, is if you have an instructor that can help try to put it together for you, because a lot of people don't have that knowledge just out of the box to put all this stuff together. But I think people are wanting to, and this goes back to what I was saying. But I think Bill McKibben, his organization 350.org, is doing important stuff. I think the problem is if you look at this stuff, if you take it seriously, it puts us in a position is that we can either save the planet and all the people on it mainly, and animals, or we can have capitalism. I don't think we can have both. I mean, there's just no way, because capitalism requires growth. And growth is what's killing us. So it's one or the other. But because of empire, because we think we're number one, you know how everybody just goes, we're not number, oh, wrong figure. Anyway, sorry, that was videotape. Hi, folks at home. Anyway, because of this, we are so busy worrying about people coming and killing us, whether it's overseas, whether it's rogue LAPD officers or whatever, that we quit thinking. And we've got to, and I really think the key to this is this American nationalism that we've had shoved down our throats all our lives. You know, we've got to challenge this. Yes, this is a great country in some ways, and it's done great things, and yes, it's done terrible things. You know, and we don't want to talk about the terrible things. I ask my kids almost every semester, it comes up in class, how many of you know that the U.S. fought a war against the Philippines? And I'm delighted when I find one or two. But the reality is we did fight a war against the Filipinos. We killed between 10 and 20% of their entire population, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people, men, women, and children. And it was an incredibly brutal war, but one of the things that almost never gets taught in our textbooks is the Philippine-American War. And I can go on and on. We still haven't dealt with Vietnam. That's why the Terse book is so incredibly important. The Oliver Stone series and the book going, this is important stuff. It's getting out, and people, I think it's very important stuff. So,
thank you. You just mentioned a few ideas. I truly believe that while we're scattered in the information that we have, and you are right, inch by inch, things are getting out. We still have to deal with two issues. One is our capacity to deny. Okay? We have PhDs, and I don't want to hear it, I don't want to listen, I don't want to deal. Because if I really hear it, it means I have to act. Okay? And number two, we're dealing with propaganda that is brilliant. And if anyone saw Zero Dark 30, it was a brilliant movie. And it was just about the best piece of propaganda I have seen in many, many years. Not because it justifies torture, but because it justifies killing of a man who was not necessarily responsible for 9/11 or any other horrible thing. And we're talking about this polluting the minds of the national population. So the question to me and to everybody who cares about these things is, how do we form vocabularies and messages that will get people to, in their gut, begin to understand what this planet is confronting? It's a message issue, baby. And because it's a message issue, I think good people have to get together and figure out the right words in the right way so that people can begin collectively, not inch by inch, piece by piece, but collectively begin to organize.
Thank you, Glenn. I think you're right. I mean, the capacity to deny is unbelievable. I think we're all giving an extra dose being Americans when we're born. As far as propaganda, absolutely. But this is where, see, one of the things that I find really discouraging about the left is the competition.
Oh, God, yes.
If my group or people, my analysis is not, if somebody has a different approach, we can't promote it. We can't have some. So, for example, I really value, and I think he's very important, is the work of Michael Moore. Now, I disagree with a lot of what Michael says, okay? But I think he's done a brilliant job in getting those messages out, to challenging people's thinking about things, to raising issues that nobody else has done it. I mean, he sold $120 million worth of tickets to Fahrenheit 9/11 alone. That was stuff that has gotten out there. But most people who don't agree with every sentence that he says, they won't promote him. I think that's stupid. I mean, it's just, that's the nicest thing I can say about it, is why don't we promote folks that are doing good work? I don't care if you disagree with me. If you're doing good work, I'll put it out. I'll put your name out. I give you credit where I can. And then I'll say, I disagree with the brother or sister, but their work is important. They're at least doing it. I think everybody else should know about it. And that is something very, very, very few on the left will do. And I don't care how many times one person will do it. Like this is one of the things I've been doing for years in all my book, is I'll promote anybody that I reasonably can, that I know of their work, even if I disagree with them. I have a woman who stuck a knife in me so bad years ago and twisted it and beat me up on pulling the knife out of my back, and I still cite her stuff in my work because she did an article that was absolutely brilliant. And I think we've got to start doing that, is we've got to start saying, if people are doing good work, let's at least acknowledge that they're out there doing it.
But first turn around.
Well, that would thank you, Sean. So, but the question gets back, I mean, I think Leanne was right as far as the importance of messaging, but what message are we conveying? That's what I think also has to be out there. We have to communicate it. I think we do a better job than most people realize, but I think it's so incoherent, we lose a lot of the power of that messaging because we're not in the same boat. Oh, you have a Marxist analysis and I'm not a Marxist. Well, therefore we can't cite each other. You're writing for The Nation, I'm writing for Z. Well, I can't cite you and you can't cite me. I mean, I have it happen all the time, and it irritates the hell out of me. You don't have to agree with me at all, but if I'm doing good work, I think you ought to at least say, hey, Kim Scipes is doing this work. I disagree with him. I think he's off on a tangent, but damn it, he's put in the hours, he's put in the time. Let's at least recognize that, because I'm doing that for others out there, and I don't see a lot of it happening. I think it's a tragedy. Okay, Peter.
Thank you, Kim. I want to leave most of the discussion and the leftism and the politics, and just talk a little bit about the chemistry and the science in capitalist production. And a lot of this can be found in the article that you mentioned, in the two articles in the monthly review, talking about how inextricable our entire life and all capitalist production, and the way we bring the things to ourselves that allow us to live and live on the planet and live in these highly organized, highly complex systems. You mentioned the Industrial Revolution starting in 1750. Well, that's, since between then and now, all this extra value and all the great things and great stuff that's been built then has been at the expense of fossil fuels. And just to put things in a little perspective, even though a gallon of gasoline takes a lot of energy to create, a gallon of gasoline can do as much work, can lift as much gravel a certain distance, as one human being working for 6 weeks. So that's one of the reasons we use fossil fuels.
Right.
When you eat a potato, you are not harnessing the energy of the sun anymore. I mean, it takes the sun as necessary to make an agricultural product. But when you eat a potato, you're harnessing the energy of fossil fuels to bring fresh water from far away, to make the fertilizer that makes the continual use of the soil possible, to mechanically harvest that potato, and to bring that potato far away from its place of manufacture to your table. So, and similarly, and this is in that article too, when you buy a product like a bar of soap or a box of detergent, there's an awful lot of value that's been spent in making that a box of soap detergent that's not part of the price, a full third of it. And that involves the corporation that hired someone to design the colors on the box, to do the marketing and the advertising on television, to bring the ingredients for that soap from far away to the factory to have it made, to transport that bar of soap away from the factory to you. All those things are problems, and let's not forget, you go in the grocery store, there's 10 brands of soap that compete against one another. All this is waste, is complete and utter waste. That's one of the ways that Soviet and Chinese production used to be able to compete with capitalist productions. They don't have to pay for any of that. So in our life, and all these things we do, there are all these hidden costs that use up this enormous amount of fossil fuels that aren't necessary to make these things and for us to use them. You spoke, Shell talked about the possibility of a high-tech fix. Well, that's been gone into. That's the idea of a high-tech fix. Geoengineering is an absolute certainty. There's going to be geoengineering to try and fix this. But it's going to be a disaster too, for a couple of reasons. One is intuitive, and Glenn pointed this out to me, is that capitalism can't fix itself, and high-tech can't get us out of a situation that was caused by high-tech. And high-tech is going to be at the service of the people who reap the most reward from this world, not the people who do the producing in this world. And that high-tech fixes would be pumping a tremendous amount of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere to block the rays of the sun. And even were it to be semi-successful, it is a tremendous gamble, because if there's a huge, for instance, if there's a huge volcanic eruption, that'll double the amount of sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere and will cause a catastrophic ice age, which may seem ridiculous, but this idea of trying to change the entire way that, in a very short time, try and change the entire way that the Earth absorbs the sun is like I say, extremely risky idea. And on top of it, there's going to be the aesthetic problem that every time you look out the window, the sky's going to look different than it did before. There's going to be no wilderness left. Our soils are nearly exhausted. It'd be called the end of nature as we know it. And I know I'm getting off on a tangent. But I want to stop with, for me, what the biggest tragedy of climate change is that it's going to make so many of the concerns you mentioned that are not unrelated, concerns about the problems with capitalism and the empire, they're going to make them that much harder for us to work against in the public eye, because as disaster gets worse, it's going to chase most of our concerns off the public agenda. And because everything's going to be in terms of survival and the terrible tragedy that's becoming apparent to everyone. So we've got our work cut out for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. One thing I'll say real quickly on this that I didn't tie in, I should have, I skipped it over. One of the things is we're spending on the base military budget something like $680 billion this year. Now, there's a new article by David K. Johnson that just came out. Johnson used to write for the New York Times. He writes on taxes, and he's a pretty sharp guy. He argues that the real military spending, when you put everything in there, is about $1.3 trillion a year. Now, the fact is that we, we're in a terrible budgetary situation. The right wing wants us to cut social problems, but the reality is that would hurt so many people. But yet we have this military budget that's sitting there. And I think what we can do is we can argue that money spent for the military cannot provide education. It cannot provide health care. It can't mitigate climate change. It can't provide infrastructure for our society, et cetera, et cetera. And I think if we put it up in that way, that we have a choice. Do you want to go kill more people? Do you want to buy more drones, whatever? Or do you want to take care of our people? And we need to extend it more than just Americans when we say our people. But I think the choice is that clear. We can make that to Americans. And I think more and more people are aware, when you put it that way, they're aware of it and willing to listen to that. Okay. Yes, sir.
I find your analysis very important, and I'm very glad to be here. And I'm also glad for the responses that the other people have made to your one of the things that occurred to me was that in the fake news area, the Comedy Central's daily report with Jon Stewart and others, they are really exciting the young people in this country, and you can tell from the applause that they receive in their programs. Another thing I wanted to bring up, you mentioned the Iraq War and its incomplete analysis. I wanted to offer something along those lines. Iraq was a very unusual country. It was the most secular country in the Middle East. It has 5 freshwater rivers. It has the most industrialized, it was the most industrialized country in the Middle East. It has a port near Basra in the south, which has access to the Indian Ocean and the whole Pacific. And it had the only 2 refineries in the Middle East. All of the oil the fossil fuels were under the Kurdish land in the north, but that's beside the point. Now, with all of that information, with all of that goodness, it was clear why the United States wanted to attack Iraq. It would give the United States a base of operation that would enable it to completely control not just Eastern Europe, all of North Africa, and a good part of Western Asia with military goods. And remember that as soon as Saddam was eliminated, even before Saddam was killed, the United States had begun building 35 military bases in Iraq. Those bases are complete now, they're still there. And the amount of military may have decreased, but the bases are still there. And a great temptation for the United States to do that.
I thank you for that comment. I think you're right. I think the issue of control is a key one. I would approach it a little differently in understanding that. Well, first of all, as we know, the 3 things Bush said we went to war for. The weapons of mass destruction never existed. The enriched uranium from Niger was a false thing from the beginning. And that Saddam Hussein was tied into a 9/11 was a lie, because he and Osama were political opponents. In fact, he wouldn't let Osama operate in Iraq. Those were lies. Then we came up with the story about democracy. Well, once you learn that Saddam Hussein was on the CIA payroll from 1958 to 1991, that blew that one all to hell. Okay, so then it gets the question of oil. And some of us, I mean, there have been people that have talked about no blood for oil and stuff like that. But you know, if we went there for the oil, we should have seen tons and tons of oil come to this country and oil prices plummet. Now, I don't know about you, but I haven't found those gas stations with the real super low gas prices. So this got me to thinking, and first of all, how many know how much oil we got out of the Gulf before the war? I checked, we got 17.7% of our oil out of the Persian Gulf area. Now, we've been told all our lives that we're dependent on this. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't find 17.7% of anything to be dependence. So I started asking, who is dependent? Well, all of Western Europe other than France. Okay, Japan, totally. China to an increasing amount. India to an increasing amount. One of those things those 4 areas all had is that they were either economic competitors or potential economic competitors to us. So I'm arguing that when we built those bases, and I know of 14, 35 may be correct, I don't know, But the idea was to put our hand around the oil supply, around the throat of the oil supply of our economic competitors so that we could shut it down anytime we wanted to. And that's what I think it was an issue of power to be able to shut that down. So I'm in the ballpark with you. I have a little different analysis, but I think we're in the ballpark there, a much more honest understanding.
What about Halliburton contracts?
Well, that's in there too. There's no question they've made tremendous amounts of money. I mean, it's obscene. But I think the larger picture is that one of controlling our opponents. Yes, sir.
Okay, my question is kind of relevant to what you just were talking about. I think I heard you say that we weren't in Vietnam entirely for economic reasons.
Right.
Okay. During the 60s and 70s, I asked myself and tried to read about this, and I'd like to have you give me an answer. It doesn't have to be a real long one. Why was it appropriate for the United States, the most powerful country in the world, for about 20 years, to go thousands of miles overseas and try to destroy a tiny little third world country that could never possibly hope to compete with its rifles and sandbags?
I think it's got to. I mean, I think it's got to be put in that geopolitical analysis. Remember, we had the domino theory, and China had just fallen, right? And they were afraid Vietnam would fall, and Laos would fall, and Cambodia would fall. What? Indonesia as well. All these things would fall, and it would just kill us. Well, even if it did, so what? I mean, that's one of the questions. The other thing, I mean, it's very parallel to Cuba, your question. Cuba's got less than 9 million. They're smaller than New York City. And we've got an embargo on them for 50 some odd years and all this other weirdness. And we almost blew up the world because of Cuba. What the hell for? There's no rational reason for us when we look at it. But the thing is, I don't think the powers that be want to have any type of positive example where people take over and control their own destiny.
And the question remains, why?
Well,
You just said all this BS.
It's a global protection racket. The
Why?
mafia
Why
can't
did
handle
we do that?
Because you're controlling the way you think. I don't like the program.
I think it's an issue that they think the only way that we can survive, we being the U.S. and their system, is by dominating everybody else.
Historians at the time said, it's the way we are. We had slavery in this country, and we got all this free land out there by killing off all the Indians so that we could call it capitalism. And that's the way we are. Philippines, and on and on and on. Now, unless we have universal brain transplants, I don't see where it's going to change.
Well, I appreciate that point, and you may be right, unfortunately. But see, one of the things that I remember personally is I was in the U.S. Marine Corps from 1969 to 73. And if there's a place in the world that there should have never been a social movement emerge, it was in the U.S. Marine Corps. And we built one. And there's a wonderful film called Sir, No Sir that if you haven't seen it, you should. It's on Netflix. And it talks about the building of an anti-war movement within the U.S. military. And that's what caused, I mean, besides the Vietnamese total willingness to accept any cost, short of that, it was because of that anti-war movement within the U.S. military that forced us to lose. Can we build that upsurge again? I don't know. But we've got at least that one example. Plus, we have the civil rights movement. We have the women's movement. We have some things in our history. Can we pull it together? Can we recreate that? That's an open question. But we've done it before. It's not like we've never done it before.
You don't heard enough yet.
Yeah.
So to just start with the last point about the anti-war movement, unfortunately, veterans for peace, veterans from Iraq, veterans, Vietnam veterans, have learned the lesson, but they're all veterans. Okay, those that survived, so-called. So the one factor, and I appreciate it was an excellent talk about the multidimensionality of capitalism. The one factor that I would add is, and that may be the hardest one, is the mentality, the culture, the motivation that fuels the question, how come we go for it? How come the shift? There is an element of very strong irrationality in our going into the war, in our cooperating with a system that acts against us, in voting for people who are not going to serve us. So this remains, I think, the toughest one. You mentioned that it's possible, and I appreciate what you do with your students. And luckily, you publish enough so you can have tenure too, so you can afford doing that. But, I mean, the rest of the people, and look at the age, not only, there is another sociology professor here, and he left, Lauren. People are not in the position to really do that and influence. And also the age. There were, I think, there are 3 young people, young I mean, under 60.
Let's not get insulting now.
But, yeah, it's where are the young people? We have to concentrate. The only hope for changing the culture and mentality is the young people, because my age group, I just don't want to insult you, is just too invested in thinking in a certain way, and it's extremely difficult both for the ego and for everything else to change. So I want to hear more solutions, more ideas as to how can we really deal with this horrible triple-headed issue.
Wow, like I have all the answers. No, it's. I mean, you raise incredibly important issues, needless to say. How do we get young people inspired? Part of the thing is, I think there's probably more young people involved. They're involved in different ways. For example, UCLA does a survey every year of incoming college freshmen. They've been doing it since the 60s. And in 2002, they did it right before 9/11. This is the first one, or the latest one I've really looked at in depth. And so they surveyed the students coming in 2000 and 2001. And something like 250,000 college students across the country. And it turned out, one of the questions they asked was, have you participated in a political demonstration? And you know, more kids participated in political demonstrations coming into college in 2002 than had done so in 1967. But we don't know that. Part of the thing is, of course, the 60s, we had the war, we had the women's movement, of course we had the civil rights, black power movement, and the media, this was all new to the media, so wow, they covered this stuff, and they haven't done it the same way anything more, because they don't want to encourage anybody.
Now they cover the Tea Party.
Well, yeah, they cover the people. But the point being is there are a lot of kids out there trying to do things. I mean, I have a 28-year-old student. He was a Marine. He went to Iraq, served in the infantry, and unfortunately saw a lot of bad stuff. But one of the things he got out of it, he turned against the war because of the damage we were doing to the Iraqis. And he's turned around, he came back, he refused to go back to Iraq, so they threw him out. And he's come to school, and we just happened by luck to meet. And now he has got a 2-hour-a-week radio program in Michigan City, Indiana. Now that's the center of the universe, you know. But he's got a 2-hour-a-week program that is totally uncensored. And what he's been doing with this, the thing is, what makes it amazing is it is live streamed anywhere in the world. And what he's been doing is he's been calling up and interviewing some of the leading global thinkers, scholars, and activists from around the world. Noam Chomsky has been on this rinky-dink radio station in Michigan City 3 times already. He's had people like Derek Jensen. He's had Indiana Shiva, Francis Fox Piven. And here's a young kid that's doing this. And the guy that owns the radio station is so impressed he doesn't even make him raise money for commercials because he thinks they're going to be able to syndicate this program nationwide. So you can hear, and this stuff is online, you can archive it. He's got a great following in Brazil and Japan that we've been able to find out. Okay, but these are people that are trying to find new ways to communicate. And there's a lot of things you can put young people down for. I mean, if you ever sit in a bar and see two people sitting next to each other that are tweeting each other instead of talking, it'll blow your mind. But then again, some people are using this new technology to reach out.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention this because the young people in here, I want you to look up Professor George Whitesides. Is the top chemist in the world, recognized as the top one. And he was at a conference in Northwestern University talking to doctors. And in front of everybody, he said, we have to stop curing cancer. And everybody is wondering, what is he talking about? He said, we have to stop producing cancer. We throw into the sea, and people call me names because I repeat this all the time, we throw in 4,500 tons of plastic into the sea every day. This plastic is because of ultraviolet and so on. It deteriorates into chemicals that affect life on the sea. It changes the chemistry, the pH. It is a disaster of magnitudes that we cannot predict because this will last for thousands of years today. So that was my...
Thank you. No, that's a very good point. I think that's all we have time for. That's fine. Thank you very much.